This is Unit 1, Lecture 11, the final lecture in Unit 1. Here we look at 20th century philosophy, plus a little bit of the 21st century. The 20th century has a lot of distinguishing characteristics, but let's note three. The first is an apparent rift between science and philosophy. Even as this rift was developing in the 19th century, it became big in the 20th century. Even today in the 21st century, there are people who assume that studying things scientifically and studying things philosophically are two different ways of studying. There was, for the better part of the second half of the 20th century, a tension between analytic philosophy, which believed that the only purpose of philosophy was to clear up linguistic and conceptual confusion, and speculative philosophy, which is the philosophy we've been talking about all along. The willingness to speculate about whether there's a God, for example, and what does it mean to love, and can we know something, or is everything a matter of belief? Finally, there was the rise of postmodern philosophy, and that has persisted. And Allen and Springstead devote 2 chapters to postmodern philosophy. The postmodern philosopher says that there is no objective truth. Truth is whatever the people in power say it is. The 20th century has seen an increased specialization of disciplines and increased interest in quantifying data and evaluation of those data. So old-fashioned speculative philosophy looks out of place. But this rift is more myth than reality, since much of science came from people whose interests were philosophical as much as it was hard science. If you look at the thinking of Albert Einstein, for example, he was a philosopher and he didn't apologize for it. Many of his questions started philosophically, even if they ended up answering themselves in terms of scientific formulas like E equals mc squared. The rift is reflected in analytic philosophy's growing influence over speculative philosophy. As noted, analytic philosophy said the main purpose of philosophy is to clear up ambiguous words and thoughts, and thus to solve philosophical puzzles by dissolving them. Among the more famous analytic philosophers were Ludwig Wittgenstein, G.E. Moore, and Bertrand Russell. You'll encounter Wittgenstein and Russell in Allen and Springstead's book. Back to speculative philosophy. It continues the traditional work of philosophy, tackling the big questions, and it doesn't reduce their import to the language used to formulate them. Allen and Springstead make a big deal, especially, of 20th century existentialism and 20th century phenomenology. You'll also see that that postmodern philosophy is somewhat more speculative than analytic philosophy. 3 notable types of 20th century speculative philosophy include pragmatism, phenomenology, and existentialism, though Allen and Springstead do not spend too much time on pragmatism. Now back to postmodern philosophy, because this brought the 20th century to an end and also ushered philosophy into the 21st century. It holds that there is no absolute truth, that the currently received truth is the product of people in power to promote that truth. Postmodernism resembles 18th century skepticism. I didn't talk about that much when we talked about early modern philosophy, but you may remember that David Hume was in the list of empiricists, and Hume was a skeptic. There's also something in 19th century nihilism, which began as a literary movement that held that there's nothing of absolute value, and postmodernism resembles both of these. But postmodernism has given way to a more optimistic view of human knowledge in the 21st century and a much broader view of thinking that we might as well call for now globalism. This holds that there is a global way to think about things, and if we're not there yet, we should aim for it. This is the end of our brief look at 20th and early 21st century philosophy and the end of Unit 1. Next, we look at logic, the 5th of 5 branches of philosophy, and the basic tool of philosophy in all of its forms and applications.